The great throne hall of St. James was a suffocating masterclass in gold leaf and pretension. The air, thick with the cloying scent of 1,000 lilies and the metallic tang of beeswax, seemed to press against Cassia Wellesley's lungs like a physical weight. High above, the massive crystal chandeliers trembled with the vibration of the orchestra's final sweeping chord, casting a jagged, fractured light over the cream of the tun. Then came the silence. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a sudden, violent vacuum of sound. Her Majesty, Queen Catherine, the Lord Chamberlain's voice rang out, brittle as parchment. As if pulled by a single, invisible string, the wave of humanity began to break. To Cassia's left and right, the silk and satin of the aristocracy collapsed toward the floor. The rustle of petticoats sounded like a forest of dry leaves caught in a sudden wind. Countesses, duchesses, and debutantes vanished into deep, sweeping curtsies, their foreheads bowed low in a display of practiced, fearful submission. Cassia felt the heat of her mother's frantic whisper from the floor beside her. "Cassia, get down! For the love of God, girl, kneel!" But Cassia Wellesley did not move. She stood at the very edge of the central aisle, her spine a column of unyielding marble. While every other soul in the room was bent double, Cassia remained upright, her chin tilted at an angle that bordered on the treasonous. She wore a gown of deep, midnight emerald, a color that seemed to absorb the golden light around her, making her stand out like a dark flame in a room full of pale moths. At the far end of the hall, Queen Catherine froze. Her foot, encased in a jewel-encrusted slipper, stopped mid-step upon the red velvet dais. The queen was a woman who measured her power by the degree of the spines curved before her, and in this moment, there was a glaring, upright defiance in her line of sight. The queen's face did not redden with anger. Instead, it turned to stone. The flesh around her eyes tightened, turning them into two cold, blue chips of Arctic ice. Behind her, the royal guards shifted, the subtle clatter of their sabers against their thighs echoing with lethal intent in the hushed room. Cassia's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she did not let her gaze waver. She thought of the young maid she had seen earlier that afternoon, dismissed without pay, thrown into the gutters of London because she had tripped over the Queen's pet spaniel. She thought of the arrogance of a crown that demanded the soul along with the ceremony. Her refusal was not a lack of manners. It was a refusal to acknowledge the divinity of a tyrant. "Lady Cassia," the Queen said, her voice a low, dangerous purr that carried to every corner of the silent hall. "It appears the weight of your family's history has made your knees too stiff for proper decorum." "My knees are quite supple, Your Majesty," Cassia replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "It is simply that I reserve my bowing for those I truly respect." A collective gasp, sharp as a blade, swept through the room. Cassia's mother made a small, choked sound of despair, burying her face further into her skirts. "My beautiful family, before we dive into this interesting story, I need to share something important with you. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and right now, there are only limited spots to be among our founding 1,000, our inner circle who were here from the beginning. And I want you to be among our most cherished first 1,000. These first 1,000 subscribers will always hold a special place in this community. You'll be the ones who believed in these stories when we were just starting out, the ones who helped build something beautiful. But here's the thing. Once we hit that milestone, that opportunity closes forever. You'll still be welcome, but you won't be part of that exclusive founding group who shaped this channel's journey. So if you've been watching without subscribing, now is your moment. Don't let this story end without you being part of our family. And tell me where you are watching from. Now, let's get into the story. Queen Catherine took a single step down from the dais. The silence deepened, becoming so heavy it felt as though the very walls were closing in. The Queen's hand, white-knuckled and trembling with a cold, refined rage, gripped the head of her golden staff. "Respect is not a choice in this court, girl," the Queen hissed. "It is a requirement for survival." Catherine gestured sharply to the captain of the guard. The steel rang out as two men stepped forward, their faces grim masks beneath their plumed hats. They moved toward Cassia, their heavy boots thudding against the polished floor, a sound like the ticking of a clock counting down the final seconds of her freedom. Cassia felt the cold breath of the tower on her neck. She had known this would happen. She had known the price of her pride, and yet, as the guards reached for her arms, she did not flinch. She prepared herself for the iron grip, for the scandal that would bury the Wellesley name forever. But the guards never reached her. A shadow, vast and imposing, cut across the golden light of the aisle. The air in the room seemed to chill, the temperature dropping as a new presence made itself known. It was a presence that didn't just command the room, it owned it. "Stand back," a voice commanded. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonant, baritone authority that brought the guards to a dead halt. From the darkened shadows of the gallery, Killian Vane, the Duke of Somerset, stepped into the light. He was a man of sharp angles and darker rumors, his black evening coat fitting his broad shoulders like a suit of armor. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept over the scene with a chilling detachment. He didn't bow to the Queen. He barely spared her a nod as he walked directly toward Cassia, stopping so close that she could smell the scent of sandalwood and old leather clinging to him. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, before turning his gaze toward the throne. "The lady is not being insolent, Catherine," Killian said, his use of the Queen's first name sending a fresh wave of shock through the assembly. He placed a possessive, heavy hand on Cassia's shoulder, the heat of his palm seeping through the thin silk of her gown. The Queen's eyes narrowed until they were mere slits. "Explain yourself, Somerset, before I have her dragged to the dungeons alongside you." Killian's lips curved into a ghost of a smile, a cold, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "She does not bow," the Duke declared, his voice ringing with a terrifying finality, "because she acts under my express command. She is my betrothed, Your Majesty, and as the future Duchess of Somerset, her loyalty and her movements belong to me alone. If there is a price for her standing tall, I shall be the one to pay it." Cassia looked up at the man whose hand now felt like a brand upon her skin. She had never spoken more than 10 words to the Duke of Somerset in her life. She knew him only as the Iron Duke, a man whose cold heart was said to be as impenetrable as the walls of his northern fortress. The Queen stared at them both, her face a mask of thwarted fury. The lie was massive, scandalous, and utterly transparent to anyone who knew the Duke's solitary nature. And yet, because of his power, because of the armies and the land he controlled, it was a lie that could not be challenged in public. "Is this true, Lady Cassia?" the Queen demanded, her voice trembling with the effort to remain composed. "Are you indeed the future Duchess of Somerset?" Cassia felt the Duke's fingers tighten slightly on her shoulder. A warning, a tether, and a lifeline all at once. She looked at the Queen, then up at the dark, dangerous man who had just traded his reputation for her life. "I am," Cassia whispered, the lie tasting like copper on her tongue. The silent rebellion had ended, but a much more dangerous war had just begun. The silence that followed the Duke of Somerset's proclamation was more than a mere absence of noise. It was a physical pressure, heavy enough to make the crystal chandeliers above seem to tremble. Every eye in the great throne hall was fixed upon the tableau at the center of the aisle. The defiant girl in emerald, the dark, towering Duke, and the Queen whose authority had just been intercepted with the precision of a duelist's blade. Killian Vane did not look at the court. His hand remained firm on Cassia's shoulder, a gesture that was ostensibly protective but felt, to her, like the closing of a velvet-lined trap. He stared directly at Queen Catherine, his expression one of bored granite. He was a man who had survived the bloodiest campaigns on the continent, and he looked at the monarch not as a subject, but as an equal negotiating a boundary. A betrothal? The Queen's voice was thin, vibrating with a lethal skepticism. She descended the final step of the dais, her silk skirts hissing against the floor. The Duke of Somerset, who has famously shunned every debutante for a decade, has suddenly found his heart in the hands of a girl who cannot even remember her manners? Love often finds us in the most inconvenient moments, Your Majesty, Killian replied, his baritone voice smooth and utterly devoid of warmth. And as for her manners, Lady Cassia was merely preoccupied with the news I had just delivered to her. My apologies if my enthusiasm for our union caused her to forget the protocol of the room. The lie was so audacious, it felt like a slap. Cassia felt the Queen's gaze turn toward her, sharp and searching, looking for a crack in the veneer. Her mother, still half collapsed on the floor nearby, looked as though she might faint, while the rest of the ton watched with bated breath. This was a scandal that would be whispered about for a century. The day the Iron Duke claimed the rebel girl. I find it curious, the Queen hissed, stopping inches from them, that the Lord Chamberlain received no notice of this alliance. A duke's betrothal is a matter of state, Vane. It was to be announced tomorrow, Killian lied effortlessly, his thumb brushing against the silk of Cassia's gown in a way that made her skin prickle. But given the sudden tension in the room, I felt it best to claim my prize tonight. I'm sure you understand the desire to protect what is one's own. The Queen looked at the guards, who were still standing frozen between the throne and the girl. She could order them to proceed. She could arrest Cassia and challenge the Duke. But to do so would be to declare war on the North, on the Duke's vast wealth, and on the man who held the keys to half the king's treasury. The calculation played out behind Catherine's cold eyes. Very well, the Queen said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only the three of them could hear. You have her for tonight, Somerset. But do not think a duke's ring is a shield against the tower if this is found to be a charade. I will have the truth of this. And if she is not your wife by the turn of the season, I will have her head. She will be exactly where she belongs, Killian said, his eyes narrowing. He didn't wait for a formal dismissal. He bowed just enough to satisfy the barest requirement of the law, then turned, his arm sliding from Cassia's shoulder to grip her hand with bruising strength. We are leaving. He didn't lead her. He moved with such momentum that she was forced to practically run to keep pace with his long, predatory strides. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, the courtiers drawing back in a mix of awe and terror. Cassia caught glimpses of shocked faces, her sister's pale masks of envy and confusion, her father's slack-jawed disbelief. But she didn't stop. The cool night air of London hit her like a bucket of ice water as they burst through the palace's grand entrance. The Duke's carriage, a black-painted beast pulled by 4 restless stallions, was already pulling up to the curb, the footman scrambling to open the door. "Get in," Killian commanded, his voice no longer the smooth silk he had used with the Queen, but a rough, jagged rasp. Cassia scrambled into the dark interior, her emerald skirts billowing around her. Before she could even settle onto the leather seat, the Duke climbed in after her, the carriage rocking under his weight. He slammed the door shut and signaled the driver. With a crack of the whip, they lurched forward, the palace lights receding into the fog. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic rhythm of the horse's hooves and Cassia's own labored breathing. She stared at the man sitting opposite her in the shadows. He looked even more formidable in the dark, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the passing street lamps. "Why?" she finally managed to gasp, her voice trembling. "You don't even know me. You just told the Queen of England that we are to be married. You've committed treason for a stranger." Killian Vane leaned forward, the light of a passing lantern catching the cold, hard glint in his eyes. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who had just purchased a very expensive and very dangerous problem. "I didn't do it for you, Lady Cassia," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "The Queen has been looking for a reason to seize my lands for years. By claiming you, I've denied her that chance. But make no mistake, you are now bound to the Iron Duke. And my protection comes with a price that may make you wish you had taken your chances with the executioner." Cassia leaned back into the shadows, the reality of her situation settling into her bones. She was no longer a prisoner of the crown, but she was now the property of a man who seemed to have no soul at all. The carriage sped north, leaving the safety of the city behind, as the first act of their desperate gamble began to unfold. The carriage lurched violently as it rounded a corner, the iron-rimmed wheels screaming against the cobblestones of Mayfair. Inside the velvet-lined cabin, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the Duke's lingering cologne, a sharp, cold aroma of cedar and ozone. Cassia gripped the leather strap hanging by the window, her knuckles as white as the pearls at her throat. Across from her, Killian Vane sat in terrifying stillness, his silhouette occasionally illuminated by the flickering amber of passing street lamps. "The Tower is a cold place for a woman who values her integrity," Killian said, his voice cutting through the rattle of the coach. He hadn't moved a muscle, yet his presence seemed to occupy every inch of the cramped space. "Queen Catherine does not issue threats for the sake of hearing her own voice. By dawn, she will have her hounds sniffing at your father's door. She will look for any reason to prove that our betrothal is a farce." Cassia straightened her emerald skirts, trying to reclaim some shred of the dignity she had brandished so boldly in the ballroom. "Then why did you do it? You told me you didn't do it for my sake. If you despise the Queen's overreach as much as I do, you've only tied yourself to a sinking ship. My family is influential, yes, but we are not powerful enough to shield you from the scandal of a fake engagement." Killian leaned forward, the light of a distant torch catching the harsh, diagonal scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "I do not need your family's influence, Lady Cassia. I need your defiance." He settled back into the shadows, his eyes tracking her with predatory focus. "The king's health is failing, and the Regency Council is divided. There is a vote approaching regarding the Northern Enclosure Acts, lands that have belonged to the Vanes for centuries. The Queen wants those lands for her favorites. She has labeled me the Iron Duke, a man too cold and detached to care for the people or the traditions of the realm. She portrays me as a monster to turn the council against me." Cassia frowned, her mind racing. "And you think a fiancé softens the image of a monster?" "I think a wife, specifically a wife known for her radical spirit and her refusal to bow to tyranny, suggests a man of hidden depth," Killian countered. "If the most rebellious woman in London chooses to stand by my side, The council will assume there is a heart beneath the armor. They will listen to my arguments if they believe I am a man capable of domestic loyalty. You are the perfect political shield." Cassia let out a short, hollow laugh. "So, this is simply a change of masters. I refuse to curtsy to a queen only to become a decorative piece on a duke's chessboard." "Hardly decorative," Killian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You will be my duchess in every way that the public can perceive. You will move into Somerset House tonight. You will manage my social calendar. You will stand at my right hand at every function. And you will convince every gossip from here to Scotland that you adore me. In exchange, I provide you with an ironclad sanctuary. No guard will touch you. No queen will dare arrest you. I will pay your family's mounting debts and ensure your sisters are married off to men who won't care about your treasonous reputation." The carriage slowed as they entered the darker, more secluded streets leading toward the Duke's massive town residence. Cassia looked out the window, watching the fog swallow the London skyline. She thought of the tower's damp stone walls and the sound of a heavy iron bolt sliding home. Then she looked at the Duke, a man who offered freedom in exchange for a performance. "And when the vote is over?" she asked. "When you have your land secured and the Queen has retreated?" "Then we shall find a quiet way to end it," Killian said, though his gaze lingered on her for a second too long for the words to feel entirely honest. "An annulment, perhaps, or a quiet life on separate ends of my estate. You will have your independence back and a fortune to fund it." Cassia reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she extended it toward him. "I want it in writing. I want your word that you will not interfere with my personal convictions, even if they embarrass you." Killian looked at her hand, then slowly reached out and took it. His skin was hot, his grip firm and overwhelming. He didn't shake her hand. He held it, his thumb tracing the line of her wrist where her pulse jumped like a trapped bird. "Agreed," he whispered. "But remember the Queen's warning, Cassia. If we fail to be convincing, we both hang. From this moment on, you are the future Duchess of Somerset. You will act as though you would burn the world down to keep me warm. And I shall play the part of the man who finally found something worth protecting." The carriage came to a halt before the towering, soot-stained gates of Somerset House. The footman opened the door, and for the first time, Killian didn't command her. He stepped out and offered his arm, waiting. Cassia took a deep breath, adjusted her mask of cold indifference, and stepped out into the night. The bargain was struck, the lie was cast, and the most dangerous game of her life had just begun. The carriage wheels transitioned from the rhythmic clatter of cobblestone to the hollow, bone-jarring crunch of gravel as Somerset House swallowed them whole. Even in the gloom of a London fog, the estate loomed like a jagged monolith against the sky. It was not a home so much as a fortress of soot-stained limestone and wrought iron, its windows narrow and dark like watchful eyes. As the footman swung the heavy coach door open, the air that rushed in was colder here, smelling of old stone and the encroaching damp of the Thames. Killian stepped out first, offering a hand that felt less like an invitation and more like a command. Cassia took it, her emerald skirts rustling with a sound like dying leaves as she descended. She looked up at the sprawling facade, feeling the sheer weight of the Duke's history pressing down on her. There were no flowers in the stone urns, no warm lanterns glowing in the foyer to welcome the master home. Only the silent, rigid lines of an architecture built to withstand a siege. "It is not the palace, Lady Cassia," Killian said, his voice low and rasping in the night air. But it is the only place in England where the Queen's warrants go to die. Step inside. As they crossed the threshold, the massive oak doors groaned shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the cavernous entrance hall. The interior was a study in shadows and cold marble. Great tapestries hung from the walls, depicting battles long forgotten, their colors faded to the hue of dried blood. The only light came from a single candelabra held by an aging butler who looked as though he had been carved from the same gray stone as the walls. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the man murmured, his eyes flickering briefly to Cassia with a mixture of shock and profound weariness. "We did not expect company." "The Lady Cassia Wellesley will be staying with us indefinitely, Miller," Killian stated, stripping off his leather gloves. "She is to be treated as the Duchess. See that the North Suite is prepared. Ensure a fire is lit. The lady has a penchant for standing in drafts." Killian began to move through the hall, his boots echoing with a lonely, rhythmic thud. Cassia followed, her eyes wandering over the curiosities that lined the corridor: ancient swords, tattered regimental flags, and portraits of vain ancestors who all possessed the same hard, uncompromising jawline as the man walking before her. But as they passed into the library, a room sprawling with thousands of leather-bound volumes, the atmosphere shifted. The Duke moved to a sideboard to pour 2 glasses of dark brandy, his movements stiff. In the dim light, without the eyes of the court upon him, the Iron Duke looked less like a conqueror and more like a man leaning under the weight of an invisible burden. He didn't look at the books. He didn't look at the fine art. He stared at the cold hearth as if waiting for a ghost to appear. "You live here alone," Cassia observed, her voice small in the vast room. "No guests, no music, no life." Killian turned, the amber liquid in his glass catching the candlelight. "A man with my reputation has little use for the trivialities of the tongue, Cassia. My neighbors think me a butcher because of the continent, and the Queen thinks me a traitor because I will not bend. This house is built to keep the world out. It serves its purpose." Cassia walked toward a large desk cluttered with maps and architectural drawings of northern drainage systems. She saw the meticulous notes written in his sharp, angular hand. Plans for tenant housing, schools, and land reclamation. These were not the works of a man who didn't care for his people. They were the works of a man obsessed with their survival. She realized then that the Iron Duke was a cage he had built for himself. He had played the villain for so long to protect his interests that the world had stopped looking for the man beneath the armor. He was a prisoner here, trapped by the very reputation that kept his enemies at bay. He lived in a fortress of his own making, surrounded by cold stone and silence, because he believed himself unworthy of anything warmer. "You're hiding," she said softly, meeting his stormy gaze. Killian's grip tightened on his glass. "I am protecting what remains. There is a difference." "Is there? You saved me tonight because you needed a shield. But look at this place, Killian. You've been using your title as a shield for years. You stay in the dark so no one can see the scars, and you call it power." For a moment, the mask slipped. A flash of raw, searing vulnerability crossed his face, gone as quickly as a lightning strike. He stepped toward her, the space between them crackling with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "Do not mistake my sanctuary for a cell, Lady Cassia," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "And do not mistake my silence for weakness. You are here because the world outside wants to break you. Inside these walls, you are safe. But do not try to rearrange the furniture of my soul. You will find it a very cold place to sit." He set his glass down with a sharp clink and gestured toward the door where the butler waited. Sleep well, Cassia. Tomorrow, we begin the lie in earnest. Try to look like a woman in love. It will be the hardest work you've ever done. As she followed the servant up the winding stone staircase, Cassia looked back one last time. The Duke was standing by the window, a solitary figure framed by the darkness, looking out at a city that feared him. She realized then that her mission was no longer just to survive the Queen. It was to see if she could find the man who had been buried alive inside the fortress of Somerset. The grey London morning had barely managed to pierce the heavy velvet drapes of the North Suite when a sharp rhythmic rapping at the door jolted Cassia from a restless sleep. She had spent the night staring at the ornate plasterwork of the ceiling, her mind replaying the Duke's haunting words about the furniture of his soul. Before she could reach for her dressing gown, the door swung open with an efficiency that bordered on an intrusion. "Good morning, Lady Cassia. Or should I say, Your Grace elect?" A woman stepped into the room, draped in a gown of stiff, peacock blue silk that rustled like a warning. She was older than Cassia, with features that were impeccably handsome, but possessed the sharpness of a honed razor. This was Lady Vanessa Caldwell, a woman whose reputation for services to the crown was whispered about in the darkest corners of Mayfair. She was officially a lady-in-waiting, but in the chess game of the court, she was Queen Catherine's most effective bloodhound. "Lady Vanessa," Cassia said, her voice raspy but steady as she sat up. "I was not aware the Duke accepted callers at such an ungodly hour. The Queen was so moved by the news of your sudden happiness that she couldn't bear for you to be without proper feminine counsel during your transition into the Somerset household," Vanessa replied, her eyes sweeping over the room with clinical precision. She lingered on the cold hearth, the single pillow used on the massive bed, and the lack of personal trinkets on the vanity. "Her Majesty has sent me to assist you with the wedding preparations. I am to stay at Somerset House until the vows are exchanged." The threat was as clear as a bell. Lady Vanessa was not here to help. She was here to observe, to poke at the seams of their story until the thread snapped. "How thoughtful of Her Majesty," a deep rumbling voice spoke from the doorway. Killian stood there, framed by the dark oak paneling. He was dressed for the day in a charcoal coat that made him look like a shadow given form. He walked into the room with an air of easy possessiveness, moving straight to the bed. To Cassia's utter shock, he sat on the edge of the mattress and took her hand, bringing it to his lips. His skin was warm, a startling contrast to the icy atmosphere Vanessa had brought with her. "But as you can see, Vanessa," Killian said, his eyes never leaving Cassia's, "the lady and I are quite occupied with our own private arrangements. I trust Miller has shown you to the guest wing. It is in the Far East Tower, quite isolated, perfect for someone who values discretion." Vanessa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Isolation can be so dull, Killian. I prefer to be where the heart of the home is. I'm sure Cassia won't mind if I join you both for breakfast. I am so eager to hear the story of your whirlwind courtship. The Tun is dying to know when the Iron Duke finally succumbed to the Wellesley charm." "The story is ours alone," Killian clipped, his grip on Cassia's hand tightening just enough to signal a warning. "But if you insist on witnessing our domesticity, you are welcome to the table. Just do not expect the theater you are used to at court. We are a somber house." The breakfast that followed was a grueling exercise in psychological warfare. The sun struggled to light the long mahogany table, leaving the three of them in a pool of dim amber light. Vanessa sat like a bird of prey, her questions darting out between sips of tea. "Tell me, Cassia," Vanessa purred, leaning forward. "Which of Killian's qualities first captured your heart? Was it his legendary silence? Or perhaps the way he ignores the social graces that the rest of us hold so dear?" Cassia looked at Killian. He was methodically cutting a piece of ham, his face a mask of indifference. She knew she had to give Vanessa something, a spark of truth to sell the giant lie. "It was his honesty," Cassia said. And to her surprise, the words felt grounded. In a court full of men who bow and scrape while sharpening their knives, the Duke was the only one who didn't pretend to be anything other than what he is. He is a man who protects what he values. I found that intoxicating. Killian's knife paused. He looked up, his stormy gaze meeting hers, and for a fleeting second, the performance felt perilously real. "And you, Killian?" Vanessa pushed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "What made you choose the girl who refuses to curtsy? Surely not for her obedience." Killian set his cutlery down with a sharp clink that echoed in the silent room. He leaned back, his presence expanding until he seemed to dwarf the table. "I chose her because she is the only person in England who looks at me and doesn't flinch. I have no need for a wife who bows, Vanessa. I have enough subjects. I wanted a partner." Lady Vanessa's eyes narrowed. She stood up, her silk skirts hissing. "A lovely sentiment, truly. I shall write to the Queen immediately and tell her how convincing you both are. But remember, a partner who knows all your secrets is a dangerous thing to keep. I look forward to our walk in the gardens later, Cassia. We have so much more to discuss." As Vanessa swept out of the room, the silence that remained was heavy and suffocating. Cassia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders sagging. "She doesn't believe us," Cassia whispered. "She doesn't have to believe us yet," Killian said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate rasp. "She only has to be unable to prove we are lying. But she will watch us when we sleep, Cassia. She will listen at the doors. From this moment on, there is no corner of this house where you are not the future Duchess of Somerset." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray London sky. "She is a spy, yes, but she is also a mirror. She will show us exactly where our lie is thin. We must become inseparable, Cassia. If you are to survive the Queen, you must learn to live within my shadow." Cassia looked at his broad back, realizing that the fortress of Somerset House had just become a much smaller, more dangerous place. The Queen's spy had arrived, and the performance of their lives had just moved into its most intimate and most perilous act. The afternoon sun struggled to penetrate the thick, dust-moated air of the Somerset Library, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of ancient vellum. Killian Vane paced the length of the Persian rug, his boots striking the floor with the precision of a march. He looked every bit the soldier he had once been, his jaw set in a line of rigid iron. "The Queen is a creature of ego, Cassia," he said, his voice echoing against the high stone ceiling. "She does not require your soul, only the appearance of its surrender. When she enters the room tomorrow for the garden inspection, you will drop 3 inches lower than a standard curtsy. Your eyes must seek the floor, not her face. You must breathe as though the very air she exhales is a gift you are humble enough to receive." Cassia sat perched on the edge of a velvet settee, her charcoal pencil scratching aggressively against a sketchbook. "You are asking me to become a shadow, Killian. I didn't survive the scandal of the gala just to vanish into the upholstery of your estate." Killian stopped his pacing and loomed over her, his presence a dark, suffocating shroud. "I am asking you to survive. Lady Vanessa is watching us from every corner. If you cannot mimic the docility the Queen expects, the Duke of Somerset's protection will be viewed as a cloak for a revolutionary. They will tear us both down." He reached down, snatching the sketchbook from her lap. Now stand. Practice the tilt of the head. Subservience is a muscle, Cassia. Flex it. Cassia stood, but she did not bow. Instead, she reached out and snatched her book back, her eyes flashing with a fire that made the Duke recoil a half step. Subservience is not a muscle. It is a rot. You've flexed it so much you've forgotten how to stand straight without your title to prop you up. She flipped the sketchbook open and shoved it toward his chest. Look at this. Since I arrived, this is all I see. Killian looked down. His breath hitched in his throat. It wasn't a portrait of a duke. It was a study of the library. But the way she had rendered the light made the room look like a tomb. In the center was a charcoal sketch of Killian, his face half hidden in shadow, his hands clenched so tightly the veins stood out in stark, jagged relief. She had captured the way he looked when he thought no one was watching, the profound, crushing loneliness of a man who had built a fortress to keep the world out, only to realize he had locked himself in with his ghosts. "This is not me," he whispered, his voice suddenly stripped of its command. "It is all you allow the world to see," Cassia said, her voice softening as she stepped into his space. She took his hand, the hand that usually held a sword or a quill with bruising force, and guided it to the page. "You spend your days teaching me how to fake a bow, yet you've forgotten how to feel a pulse. Look at the lines, Killian. They are jagged because you are always bracing for a blow that hasn't landed yet." She turned the page to a new, unfinished sketch. It was a drawing of the Somerset Gardens, but unlike the gloomy reality, she had imagined them in full, wild bloom. There was a sense of movement in the lines, a chaotic, beautiful energy. "I won't learn your lessons in submission," she told him, her gaze unwavering, "because they are the lessons of a dead man. If we are to convince the Queen and Vanessa that this is a marriage of passion, you cannot just protect me. You have to live with me." She picked up a stick of soft red chalk and pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers over it. The contact was electric, a spark that seemed to jump through the cold air of the library. "Draw something," she challenged. "Not a map, not a battle plan, not a ledger. Draw the way the light hits the Thames at dusk. Draw the way you felt when you realized you weren't going to let the guards take me." Killian stared at the chalk in his hand as if it were a live coal. He looked at the paper, then back at Cassia. For the first time, the Iron Duke looked vulnerable. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden, violent awakening of a heart that had been kept in a dark room for a decade. Slowly, awkwardly, he leaned over the desk. He didn't draw the Thames. With a few heavy, unpracticed strokes of the red chalk, he traced the silhouette of a woman standing tall. It was rough, but it possessed a raw, visceral energy. It was Cassia, standing in the throne room, unbowed. "I haven't felt anything but duty since the war," Killian confessed, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He didn't look up, but his thumb brushed against hers on the desk. "I thought if I made myself into stone, I couldn't be broken again. But you are a riot of color in a gray world, Cassia." "Then stop trying to turn me gray," she whispered. He finally looked at her, and the storm in his sea-gray eyes had changed. The coldness was gone, replaced by a simmering, terrifying heat. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, not with the possessiveness of a master, but with the reverence of a man touching fine silk for the first time. In that moment, the lesson in defiance was over, and a lesson in something much more dangerous had begun. Killian Vane was no longer just a protector. He was a man who remembered what it was to want. And as the sound of Lady Vanessa's silk skirts approached the library door, Killian didn't pull away. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against Cassia's, proving that the greatest rebellion wasn't standing up to a queen, it was opening a heart that had been closed for a lifetime. The storm that broke over London that night was not merely a summer rain, but a violent, elemental upheaval that seemed to mimic the turbulence within the walls of Somerset House. Thunder rattled the heavy stone casements, sounding like the ghost of a distant cannonade. And the wind howled through the chimneys with a mournful, human cry. Cassia found sleep impossible. Every crack of lightning illuminated the stark, unfamiliar angles of her suite, turning the elegant furniture into distorted specters. Driven by a restless energy she couldn't name, she lit a single taper and slipped out into the drafty corridor. She found herself drawn toward the library, the one room that felt as though it held the pulse of the man who had claimed her life as his own. She found him there, though he was not at his desk. Killian was standing by the tall, uncurtained windows, silhouetted against the white-blue flashes of the storm. He had stripped away his coat and cravat. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, making him look less like a duke and more like a fallen angel surveying a ruined world. In his hand was a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, but he wasn't drinking. He was simply staring into the chaos. "The thunder in London sounds different than the thunder in Spain," he said, his voice so low it was nearly swallowed by the wind. He didn't turn around. He seemed to sense her presence by the displacement of the air alone. In the Pyrenees, the sound lingers. It bounces off the peaks until you can't tell if it's the heavens breaking or the earth being torn asunder by powder. Cassia moved closer, her candle flame dancing wildly in the draft. "You were there for the retreat to Corunna, weren't you?" Killian finally turned, and the flash of lightning caught his face. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched with a weariness that no amount of ducal power could erase. "I was there for all of it. The mud, the hunger, the madness." He set his glass down and slowly began to roll up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked by silvered lines of old trauma. But it was his left shoulder that he shifted toward the light. Through the thin linen, Cassia could see the puckered, jagged shadow of a massive scar. "That wasn't from a saber," she whispered, her heart aching with a sudden, sharp empathy. "No," Killian said, his voice dropping to a jagged rasp. "That was from a mistake. My mistake." He walked toward the center of the room, his movements heavy. "Everyone calls me the Iron Duke because they think I led my men with a heart of stone. They think I am arrogant because I refuse to explain my choices to the ton. But the truth is much simpler, Cassia. I am not arrogant. I am ashamed." He stopped before a tattered regimental flag that hung in a shadow-drenched corner. "I ordered a bayonet charge on a French position that I believed was undermanned. I wanted the glory. I wanted the victory to end the campaign. But I was wrong. It was a trap." He closed his eyes, his breath hitching. "I lost 60 men in 10 minutes. Boys from my own estate. Boys I had promised their mothers I would bring home. I survived because my sergeant threw himself in front of me. I carry his lead in my shoulder, and their ghosts in my head." The silence that followed was louder than the thunder. Cassia looked at him, really looked at him, and the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. The fortress, the coldness, the refusal to let anyone near. It wasn't pride. It was a self-imposed penance. He hadn't built Somerset House to keep the world out. He had built it as a monastery where he could live out his sentence in solitude. He acted as though he were better than the world because he felt he was no longer fit to be part of it. "You've been punishing yourself for a decade," Cassia said softly, stepping into his space. She didn't hesitate this time. She reached out and placed her hand over the scar on his shoulder. He flinched at the contact, a low groan escaping his throat. But he didn't pull away. "I am a butcher, Cassia," he whispered, his head bowing. "The Queen is right to fear me. I have the blood of my own people on my hands." "No," Cassia countered, her voice ringing with a fierce, sudden conviction. She moved her hand from his shoulder to his cheek, forcing him to look at her. His skin was burning. "You are a man who suffered a tragedy and chose to carry the weight of it alone. That isn't villainy, Killian. It's a different kind of courage. But it's a courage that is killing you." The storm outside reached a crescendo, a bolt of lightning striking so close that the entire library was bathed in a blinding, ethereal light. In that white-hot moment, the distance between them evaporated. Killian reached out, his hands finding her waist with a desperate, crushing strength. He pulled her against him, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He wasn't the Duke of Somerset in that moment. He was a man seeking harbor in a storm that had lasted 10 years. "Why are you here?" he choked out against her skin. "Why didn't you run when you had the chance?" "Because," Cassia whispered, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, "I think I'm the only one who knows that the Iron Duke is made of glass, and I've never been very good at letting beautiful things stay broken." Killian pulled back just enough to look at her, his stormy eyes searching hers for any sign of deceit. Finding only the truth, he lowered his head when his lips finally met hers. It wasn't the cold, strategic kiss they had practiced for the Queen. It was a collision of hunger and relief, a midnight confession that didn't need words. The lie they had told the world was rapidly becoming the only truth that mattered. The fragile peace of the North Suite was shattered not by the storm, which had retreated into a damp, gray drizzle, but by the heavy, rhythmic pounding of a royal messenger at the gates of Somerset House. The sound echoed through the stone corridors like a funeral knell, dragging Cassia from the lingering warmth of the library and the memory of Killian's touch. By the time she reached the morning room, Killian was already there. He stood by the hearth, a piece of heavy vellum clutched in his hand. The wax seal, a deep, blood-red stamp of the royal arms, lay broken on the floor. Standing across from him, sipping her tea with a look of predatory satisfaction, was Lady Vanessa. "It seems the Queen's patience has reached its limit," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Her Majesty is so moved by your passionate, whirlwind romance that she has decided to spare you the burden of a long engagement. She has commanded that the ceremony take place 3 days from now in the Royal Chapel at St. James. She is personally overseeing the guest list." Killian's jaw was a line of jagged flint. A royal wedding is a summons, not an invitation. She knows that by moving the date forward, we have no time to prepare the legal settlements or the traditional bans. "Oh, Killian," Vanessa purred, setting her cup down with a sharp clink. "The Queen has already waived the bans. She is quite eager to see the Iron Duke and his rebel bride united before the eyes of God and the court. Of course, she expects the Lady Cassia to undergo the traditional prenuptial examination by the royal physicians this afternoon, to ensure the future Duchess is in robust health for the Somerset line." Cassia felt the blood drain from her face. The examination was a trap, a public humiliation designed to strip away her dignity and see if she would break under the pressure. More than that, the suddenness of the wedding was a test of their resolve. If they faltered, if they couldn't produce a convincing display of devotion under the suffocating scrutiny of the royal chapel, the Queen would declare the union a political fraud. "We will be there," Killian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. He stepped toward Cassia, his presence a wall of heat and steel. He didn't look at Vanessa as he placed a hand on the small of Cassia's back, a gesture of absolute possession. "Tell Her Majesty that we are honored. We shall depart for London within the hour." As soon as the doors closed behind the Queen's spy, the air in the room seemed to ignite. "She's cornered us," Cassia whispered, her hands trembling as she looked at the summons. "The royal chapel is a cage, Killian. There are 1,000 eyes there, all of them trained on us, waiting for a single missed glance or a stiff gesture. And the physicians, they will see the fear in me." Killian turned her to face him, his hands gripping her shoulders. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the fierce, focused intensity of a commander on the eve of a desperate battle. "Then we give them nothing but the truth we have found here in the dark. Cassia, look at me." He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his stormy gaze. "In the throne room, you stood tall because you hated her. In the chapel, you must stand tall because you choose me. They are looking for a lie, so we will give them a reality they cannot comprehend. I will not let those physicians touch you. I will invoke the Duke's right, an ancient privilege that allows the Somerset bride to be examined only by her own house. It will make the Queen livid, but it will keep you safe." "And the wedding itself?" Cassia asked. "The vows are for eternity, Killian. We were supposed to find a way out after the vote. If we marry in the royal chapel before the Queen, there is no quiet annulment. There is no separate life. We will be bound by the laws of the Crown and the Church." Killian's gaze didn't waver. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the crackle of the dying fire. The bargain they had struck in the carriage, the cold, calculated deal for a political shield, felt like a relic from another lifetime. The scars he had shown her, the red chalk she had pressed into his hand, the kiss in the library. They had built a bridge that neither was ready to burn. "Is that a fate you find worse than the tower?" he asked softly, his thumb brushing the line of her throat. Cassia looked into the eyes of the man who had been a butcher and a prisoner, and saw the man who had finally learned to feel. "No," she whispered, "but it is a fate that requires more than a lie." "Then we stop lying to each other," Killian said, his voice a vow in itself. "The world can believe whatever they wish. But within the walls of that chapel, the only truth that matters is the one we've made in this fortress." The journey back to London was a blur of thundering hooves and grim realization. As the carriage crossed the city limits, the soot-stained spires of St. James appeared through the mist. The royal chapel stood ready, its bells prepared to ring for a wedding that was meant to be a trap. But as Killian reached across the seat to lace his fingers with hers, Cassia realized that the Queen had made a grave mistake. She had tried to use love as a weapon, but she had forgotten that a woman who refuses to bow and a man who refuses to break are the most dangerous allies in the world. The trap was set, but as they pulled up to the palace gates, it wasn't the Duke and the lady who looked like the prey. It was the throne. The carriage ride from Somerset House to the outskirts of the London docks was conducted in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence between them. Outside, the city was a blur of gray mist and flickering street lamps. But inside, The air was thick with the scent of desperation and unsaid goodbyes. Killian sat with his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though it might shatter, his hands resting on a heavy leather satchel that contained more than just coin. It contained the deeds, the jewelry, and the portable wealth of a man preparing to vanish forever. "The ship is called the Zephyr," Killian said, his voice a low, hollow rasp that didn't sound like his own. "It's a merchant vessel under a neutral flag. The captain is a man who owes me his life from the campaign in Lisbon. He will take you to the coast of France, and from there, you will have passage to a villa in the Swiss Alps. It is under a name the Queen's spies will never find." Cassia looked at the satchel, then at the man who had spent his entire life building a fortress to protect his legacy. And what of the Duke of Somerset? What happens when the Queen realizes her prize has slipped through her fingers? Killian's gaze didn't waver, but a muscle jumped in his cheek. "The Duke of Somerset will be a ghost. I have prepared a letter for the council. I am abdicating the title and the lands in favor of my cousin in the north. By the time Catherine realizes the bird has flown, I will be a commoner with no lands for her to seize and no title for her to strip. I am trading a dukedom for your life, Cassia. It is the only bargain I have ever made that felt like a victory." The carriage lurched to a halt in the shadow of a derelict warehouse. The smell of salt and rotting timber seeped through the cracks in the door. Killian stepped out first, his cloak billowing like a dark wing in the damp wind. He reached back to pull Cassia out, his grip almost painful in its intensity. He began to lead her toward the dark silhouette of the masts at the pier, his long strides reflecting a frantic urgency. "Wait," Cassia said, digging her heels into the slick cobblestones. Killian didn't stop. "We have no time, Cassia. The tide is turning, and Vanessa's men are likely already combing the city for us. Once you are on that ship, you are free." "And you?" she demanded, jerking her hand back. "What happens to you once you've thrown away everything your ancestors bled for? You think the Queen will just let you walk away because you've surrendered your title? She will hunt you until she can put your head on a spike for the treason of denying her your loyalty." Killian turned, the moonlight catching the raw, jagged pain in his eyes. "It doesn't matter. I told you I am a man of shadows. I can disappear in ways you cannot imagine. But you are a creature of light and fire. I will not let her put you in a cage or a grave just to save a pile of stones and a hollow name. Please, Cassia, get on the boat." Cassia looked at the dark water, then at the man who was willing to commit social and political suicide for her. She saw the Iron Duke standing before her, stripped of his arrogance, stripped of his armor, offering himself up as a sacrifice. And in that moment, she realized that running was the one thing she could never do. If she ran, she would be confirming every lie the Queen had ever told about them. She would be letting the tyrant win. "No," Cassia said, her voice ringing out with a clarity that silenced the lapping of the waves. "Cassia, this isn't a game. I am not going to the Alps, Killian, and you are not giving up your dukedom." She stepped toward him, her emerald silks stained with the river mist, her chin tilted at that same treasonous angle that had started this entire war. If we run, we are cowards. If we run, we prove that our love was a convenient fiction to escape the law. But if we go back, if we walk into that chapel and take those vows, we take her power away. She cannot seize the lands of a duke who is lawfully wed to a Wellesley. She cannot execute a duchess without a trial that would burn London to the ground. Killian reached for her, his voice a broken whisper. She will kill you, Cassia. She will find a way. Then let her try, Cassia countered, her hands finding his face. You spent years in a fortress of guilt, Killian. I spent years in a prison of expectations. We found each other in the dark. I am not going to let you hide me away in another mountain fortress while you wander the world as a ghost. I want the Duke. I want the man who stands tall even when the sky is falling. She reached into his cloak and pulled out the royal summons, the red wax seal glinting like a drop of blood. We are going to St. James. We are going to walk down that aisle, and we are going to look the Queen in the eye while we say the words. You taught me that defiance is a muscle, Killian. It's time we both used it. Killian looked at her, his chest heaving. The weight of the crown, the weight of his guilt, and the weight of his fear all seemed to collide in his stormy gaze. Slowly, he reached out and took the satchel of gold, dropping it onto the wet stones. He didn't need it. He didn't say a word. He simply swept her into his arms, a kiss that tasted of salt and iron and a new, terrifying hope. He turned her back toward the carriage, his hand firm on the small of her back. To St. James, he commanded the driver, his voice regaining that resonant, baritone authority that had once commanded armies. The ship. The Zephyr sailed on the tide, empty of its intended passenger. Behind it, the carriage raced back toward the heart of the empire. The final showdown was no longer a matter of escape. It was a matter of coronation. Cassia Wellesley had refused to curtsy, but she was about to show the Queen that a woman who refuses to bow is the only one fit to wear a duchess's coronet. The morning of the royal wedding arrived not with the celebratory peal of bells, but with the heavy, rhythmic tolling of a ceremony that felt like an execution. The royal chapel of St. James was a masterpiece of suffocating grandeur, filled to the rafters with the high nobility of England, all of whom held their breath in a collective state of morbid fascination. Sunlight bled through the stained glass windows in jagged shards of crimson and violet, illuminating the path where Cassia Wellesley walked toward the altar. She was a vision in ivory silk and Somerset lace, her veil trailing behind her like a summer mist, but it was her face that captured the room's attention. She did not look like a frightened girl being led to a cage. She looked like a queen approaching a rival's borders. Beside her, Killian Vane moved with the predatory grace of a man who had finally found his purpose. Dressed in the dark, formal regalia of his dukedom, his silver-gray eyes were fixed solely on the woman at his side, ignoring the sea of whispers that parted before them. At the head of the chapel, seated upon a smaller version of the throne, Queen Catherine waited. Her face was a mask of cold, porcelain fury. She had expected to see cracks in their resolve. She had expected to see a fake betrothed trembling under the weight of a divine vow. Instead, she saw two people who walked as if the rest of the world had already ceased to exist. The Archbishop's voice droned through the liturgy, ancient and solemn. But the air in the chapel remained electric with tension. Lady Vanessa stood in the front row, her eyes darting between the couple and the Queen, waiting for the moment of hesitation, the flicker of doubt that would allow the crown to strike. If any man can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, the Archbishop intoned, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. A silence so profound, it felt heavy descended upon the congregation. Queen Catherine leaned forward, her hand tightening on the arm of her chair. This was the moment for a confession, for a slip, for the lie to crumble. but the only sound was the steady, rhythmic breathing of the Duke and his bride. "I, Killian Vane, take thee, Cassia Wellesley," the Duke began, his baritone voice ringing out with a resonance that shook the very glass in the windows. He did not look at the priest. He looked into Cassia's eyes. He spoke the vows not as a script, but as a blood oath, his hand clasping hers with a strength that promised a lifetime of protection. When it was Cassia's turn, she didn't waver. Her voice was soft but carried to the furthest corners of the hall. As she spoke the final words of her commitment, the protocol dictated that the newly created Duchess should turn and offer a deep, submissive curtsy to the Queen to acknowledge the Crown's blessing of the union. The court leaned in. The Queen sat back, a ghost of a triumphant smile touching her lips. She had won. She had forced the rebel to marry the monster, and now the rebel would finally bow. But as the prayer ended, Cassia did not turn toward the throne. Instead, in a move that caused 1,000 hearts to stop, Cassia sank slowly to the cold marble floor directly in front of Killian. It was a deep, reverent kneel, her ivory skirts billowing around her like a fallen cloud. It was the very gesture she had denied the Queen, the ultimate sign of submission and respect. But she was not looking at the monarch. Her head was bowed before the man who had shared his scars with her, the man who had been willing to lose everything to see her free. The Queen's face didn't just turn to stone, it shattered. The insult was total. By kneeling to her husband in the presence of the Queen, Cassia had declared that her loyalty, her heart, and her soul belonged to the House of Somerset, not the House of the Crown. She had rendered the Queen a spectator in her own chapel. Killian reached down, his fingers trembling with a raw, visceral emotion as he took her hands and raised her to her feet. He didn't just help her up. He drew her into his arms and kissed her with a desperate public passion that defied every law of royal decorum. In that kiss, the Iron Duke was gone, replaced by a man who was finally, irrevocably home. The Queen stood abruptly, the screech of her chair against the stone sounding like a scream. But the power had already shifted. The council members in the pews were no longer looking at their monarch with fear. They were looking at the Duke and Duchess with awe. The Iron Duke was no longer a solitary monster. He was half of the most powerful alliance in England. "The ceremony is concluded," Killian said, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd. He didn't ask for permission. He tucked Cassia's arm into his and began to walk back down the aisle. They passed Lady Vanessa, who looked as though she had been struck dumb. They passed the Queen's guards, who stood with their pikes lowered, sensing that the man walking toward them was no longer someone who could be arrested by a mere warrant. As they stepped out of the chapel and into the bright, blinding sunlight of London, the bells finally began to ring. This time they sounded like a triumph. "You knelt," Killian whispered as they reached the sanctuary of their carriage. "You gave her the one thing she wanted, and you made it the weapon that destroyed her." "I didn't do it for her," Cassia said, leaning her head against his shoulder as the carriage pulled away from the palace and toward a future they had written for themselves. "I told you, Killian. I only bow to those I truly respect. And I have never respected a man more than the one who taught me that even a fortress can be a home." The Queen's power had been stripped away not by a sword or a vote, but by a simple refusal to acknowledge it. In the heart of London, the most powerful duke in England had found his match, and the girl who refused to curtsy had finally found someone worth standing for. The game was over, and love, wild, defiant, and unbowed, had won. My sweet family. Cassia knelt for love, not for power. She risked the tower, and Killian risked his legacy, all so they wouldn't have to live a lie. After everything they sacrificed to share their truth with you, will you really leave without saying a word? Most will simply scroll away. But if you believe that true love is worth fighting for, subscribe to this channel, share this video, and comment, unbowed. Don't let their final stand end in silence. Their story lives on only through you. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.